Monsters, Inc., a film from movie studio Pixar, resonates with both audiences and critics. On RottenTomatoes.com, the film received a 96% rating from critics and a 90% score from audiences. I agree with this consensus. This is a delightful, thought-provoking, endearing, and just plain fun movie. Monsters, Inc. conveys a powerful message about not assuming received wisdom is always true, and not judging people before you get to meet them. But I'd like to take a look at a few reasons why this film is so great. Before I start, let me just say this isn't an exhaustive list. For instance, we could talk about the voice talent, Billy Crystal, John Goodman, and Steve Buscemi, for instance, the award-winning soundtrack, or the brilliant cinematography. But for this video, I'm going to talk about thematic traditions. This film follows at least two thematic traditions. Those two themes include, number one, stories where an other or a monster is feared, but then discovered to be more familiar than dissimilar to the community that fears or hates it. And number two, stories where adults reluctantly accept responsibility for a child and then come to grow into their parental role. Before this video is over, I'll point out how Monsters, Inc. puts an ingenious, unusual twist on one of these themes. And then finally, I'll suggest that these two themes are actually connected in a curious way. Before jumping into the film, it's best to define a few terms I'll be using. Those terms are other, monster, and commonplace. By other, or the other, I mean a person or group defined as being different, less than, and separate from the dominant or majority group. I'm using the term monster in two different ways. First, I'll sometimes use it in the everyday sense of the word, in the same sense that Mike, Billy Crystal, and Sullivan, John Goodman, are monsters. But I'll also use the term in a way that's similar to how I defined the other. In this sense, a monster is something that's unlike the in-group, different, scary, on the edges of reality, and not considered as having the same qualities or rights as the in-group. So, in a way, you might consider monster and the other very closely related terms, at least for the purposes of this video. Finally, I'm using the term commonplace in a similar way to its meaning in classical rhetoric. By commonplace, I mean a bit of received wisdom that is accepted as true by a community. For instance, quote, "Don't swim for a half hour after eating," end quote, is, or at least was, a commonplace. Whether it's true is a different question. In other words, commonplaces can be false. So, now that we have those terms defined, let's dive into Monsters, Inc. As I mentioned, the first theme is that of fear of the other, or of a monster, and how that other is come to be seen as friendly rather than frightening. A good way to start thinking about this theme in Monsters, Inc. is to consider the role of monsters in medieval times. In medieval Europe, monsters often represented lands that were only partially understood, or that hadn't been visited, or that were on the edge of the known world. Monsters would be seen on the corner or edges of maps, and as such they represented the edge of humanity's knowledge and the fear of the unknown. Medieval monsters were living creatures thought to be far different from people within European Christendom. These monsters were seen as both a threat to Europeans and as a troublesome edge case of who and what belonged within one's own sphere of moral obligation. For instance, Alex Bovey writes for the British Library that, quote, "For Christians, the monstrous races tested not only their credulity, but also their ethics. St. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th century CE, was not convinced that these monstrous races existed, but considered that if they did, the vital question was whether or not they were human, descended from Adam, and therefore rational and mortal. If so, they were worthy of salvation." End quote. What St. Augustine is getting at here is who belongs within a moral sphere and who doesn't. The process of othering, or considering someone or something monstrous, functions to push that someone or something out of one's own sphere of moral obligation. The process of making them part of a we, or no longer thinking of them as monstrous, functions to make one's own self morally accountable to them. The monster is no longer an other, but part of the in-group. The monster loses its monstrosity. This doesn't just apply to medieval times. In stories of a monstrous other, one of the central problems is how the community conceptualizes its relationship with the monster. In some films, the monster is meant to be destroyed. In others, the monster is meant to be listened to. But there's a branch of these types of films where the monsters are come to be understood as not so bad, as not really fundamentally different from the community that fears it. In this sense, the monster ceases to be monstrous. There's plenty of examples of films like this, including E.T., The Goonies, and some episodes of The Twilight Zone, such as The Fear. These types of stories have a penchant for emphasizing community, unity, empathy, and imagination to help build bonds between antagonists. And Monsters, Inc. clearly fits into this thematic branch. Our two main characters, Mike and Sullivan, are monsters whose job it is to scare children, so that the children's screams can be converted into energy. This energy is then used to power Mike and Sullivan's society. The monster society runs on the fear of children about to go to bed. There's a couple twists, though, to Monsters, Inc. that makes it unusual for this branch of monster films. First, we as viewers see the film primarily through the eyes of Mike and Sullivan. In other words, the audience identifies with the monster. They are what Henry James terms the central consciousness of the story, meaning the characters from whose perspective the story is most closely associated. Central consciousness is not quite the same as first-person narration, by the way. This is unusual for monster movies, where the central consciousness is often the humans. In such films, we would usually identify more with the children they are scaring, since we have all experienced being children, but not being monsters. But herein lies a second twist. The monsters are scared of the children. From Mike and Sullivan's perspective, these little tots are the scary other, whose very touch could instantly kill them or their fellow monsters. The reason they believe this is because of a commonplace shared within their community, namely, that the touch of a child is deadly to monsters. From the beginning of the film throughout close until the end, all the monsters accept as true the commonplace that any contact with a child will destroy the monsters. Yet there's never a shred of evidence to indicate that this commonplace has any merit to it. In fact, all the examples we're exposed to point in the opposite direction. These monsters, much like humans, let gossip and unproven commonplaces define their sense of the other. They are afraid of what they don't understand, and what they don't understand becomes monstrous. The monsters are scared of children, and the children are scared of monsters. From each vantage point, the foreign group is an other. In a very real sense, the monsters see the children as monsters, and the monster's economy, hierarchy, and structure is built on assuming that children really are scary, which means that there's little institutional motivation to question the commonplaces that undergird that belief. This narrative is a beautiful and clever way to upset the viewer's understanding of these terms: monsters, common knowledge, fear, and prejudice. If everyone's a monster, then what does it mean to be a monster? If we identify with the monsters, then the story's momentum runs in the direction of humanizing the monsters. Finally, if none of the characters' conception of reality is accurate, then how much faith should we put in commonplaces? All of this serves to humanize the monsters, thus creating slippage in the semantic stability of the terms monster, other, and commonplace. And this gets us to the second theme, that of reluctant parents or adults taking care of children. This theme can be seen time and time again throughout film history. These stories portray reluctant caretakers as vulnerable and therefore empathetic. And by associating Mike and Sullivan with the type of characters you'll find in The Kid, Savannah Smiles, and Three Men of a Baby, these monsters become humanized. Monsters, Inc. clearly falls within this thematic tradition. And yet, there's another twist to this second thematic tradition that connects it to the first thematic tradition. Instead of making the point myself, I'll diplomatically let someone else state it, namely writer James Q. Wilson. In the following passage, Wilson is going to take a quotation from a different writer, Norman Ryder, and add to it. I found this quotation in The Better Angels of Our Nature, a book by Steven Pinker. A lot of names, I know. Quote, "There is a perennial invasion of barbarians who must somehow be civilized and turned into contributors to fulfillment of the various functions requisite in societal survival. That invasion is the coming of age of a new generation of young people." The language here is striking. Ryder, and Wilson by extension, are referring to children as a perennial invasion of barbarians. That's basically just another term for the other, or the monstrous. Perhaps if we combine these two themes together, we get the sense that the process of rearing children is something akin to humanizing monsters. Or maybe not, just a thought. Don't be mad at me. I'm just quoting Steven Pinker's book. Well, to make a long story short, I enjoyed Monsters, Inc. and thought it cleverly addressed ideas of the other, the monstrous, and commonplaces. Thanks for watching.
It's a long way to Tipperary.